Okay, good afternoon. My name is John Meloy. I teach in the history department, and I'm here to give you a little talk about Thucydides and the Peloponnesian War. Can you read the caption on the cartoon? Is it clear? Okay, good. You can read it. I believe it will be on the midterm, but you ought to check with your the instructors of your sections. Last time I gave the lecture, I had a different cartoon, so I'm trying to introduce a little bit of variety. If you check the CS website, I think you might see the old one as well. Okay. Very good. So let's get started. This week, and I think next week, if I understand the schedule correctly, you'll be reading and discussing the history of the Peloponnesian War by Thucydides. Thucydides' history, if we could try to lower the volume of collective voices, thank you. Thucydides' history is important for understanding the ancient Greeks and for understanding the ancient Greek world. But perhaps, I think more importantly, for the purposes of CS, it provides us insight into how we understand the world that we live in, the world that we live in now, the human condition, and the standards we hold as ideals. And so it has a lot to say about our existence and our world at the level of the individual and at the level of politics and society. Now, of course, all the readings in CS do that. To one extent or another. However, I think with Thucydides, it's important to point out that what we see here when we read Thucydides is we see the Greeks starting to look at the world in a different way than they did in the readings earlier in the semester's syllabus. Okay? So with Thucydides and the Peloponnesian War, you'll start to see a kind of transformation in how people comprehend, how they comprehended their world. That works. Okay, so who was he? Who was Thucydides? First of all, he was an Athenian who lived in the 5th century BC. His history of the Peloponnesian War recounts a war between Athens and Sparta that occurred during his lifetime. On one level, the purpose of his history was to explain what happened. So people who want to know what really happened, that is, who won and who lost, and details like that, who was the victor, who was the victim, how many victims there were, can read it for that reason. Or people who want to be simply entertained can get what they want from the book as well. But many historians examine the past to uncover something of the deeper reality. Okay, this is a phrase I'm going to use a couple times through the lecture. The deeper reality, the forces and circumstances that shaped particular events. So Thucydides, I would say, is writing in order with that objective in mind. The question is then, what is Thucydides telling us in this history? He states very boldly, "My work is not a piece of writing designed to meet the taste of an immediate public, but was done to last forever." This is quite a claim. How can an account of a war that occurred 2,500 years ago possibly have any relevance for today, much less forever? Now I've given you a quote. There's one here on the PowerPoint presentation. The fly sheet includes some quotations in the outline that accompanies the lecture. All of the quotations, however, not all the quotations that I'm going to read in the course of the lecture are in that outline. Those are actually in the remainder of the fly sheet on the last 2.5 pages or so. But they're all there, all right? So between the PowerPoint presentation, my talking, and the fly sheet, you have a lot of Thucydides to look at. Not to mention, of course, the book. Most of what we know about Thucydides comes from his book. He refers to himself in the first line. Thucydides the Athenian wrote the history of the war between Athens and Sparta, he says. He lived in Athens in 5th century BC, but he was not an ordinary Athenian, not by any stretch of the imagination. He was a wealthy person. His family owned gold mines in northern Greece, He tells us that during the war he served as a general in the Athenian army. He was only 35 years old at the time. He also mentions that when he was a general, he was ordered to defend the city of Amphipolis in Thrace, in northern Greece. The city was valuable for its strategic location and obviously for its wealth, the gold mines I just referred to. But Thucydides' military expedition failed to arrive in time to defend the city against the Spartans, the enemies of the Athenians. Consequently, the Athenian assembly punished him, and Thucydides was dismissed from his command. Not only that, but he was also sentenced to exile from Athens until the end of the war. And exile from the polis, from the city, was a relatively common punishment, or a standard punishment, I would say, used at that time, being in effect evicted from your community. He took the opportunity of his forced retirement, and in effect his punishment, to research and write his history of the Peloponnesian War, and consequently he traveled extensively to interview participants in the conflict and to visit the various theaters of the war in Greece and perhaps as far away as Syracuse on the island of Sicily, where the outcome of the war was decided. He died in the year 400, however, before he could finish writing Book 8 of his work, in the middle of the narrative of the year 411 BC, with 6.5 years left of the history to recount. So the text you have is actually incomplete. He never finished it. Now, in order to understand Thucydides' book, it is helpful to consider his intellectual background. We don't know very much, quite frankly. In his history, again, he says that he admires a man named Antiphon. So we from reading the text, even though it's about this war, he occasionally kind of refers to his own experience, at least indirectly. So he says that he admires a man named Antiphon, who is a sophist and politician. Other sources suggest that he studied with a man named Protagoras, whose name you may know, right? Also a sophist. Sophism, very briefly, was a prominent intellectual movement in 5th century Greece, known for the use of rhetoric in argumentation. So one of its proponents claimed, for example, that he could make the weaker argument the stronger. Thucydides, however, seems not to have been interested in the usual benefits of sophism. I mean, who, for example, would benefit from a course of study in which you're taught to make the weaker argument the stronger? Plato, later on, associated sophism with the political ambitions of well-to-do young men in Athens. In other words, people who wanted to go into politics wanted to use that type of skill in order to achieve their own personal ambitions. Plato clearly didn't think much of sophism. And the word actually gives us the word sophistry, which has a pejorative connotation in English. Having said that, we see some of the influence of sophism in Thucydides' rhetorical techniques. For example, in his presentation of antithetical elements, that is, elements that oppose each other. The cities of Athens and Sparta are opposed in the course of the text. You can think about how they are kind of positioned against each other. Or the politicians Pericles and Cleon. Again, these two men have different characters. And as you read the text, think about how Thucydides situates them opposite from each other. Why does he do this? What do these cities and men represent to him? That's something for you to talk about in class. He also reports two sides of political disputes. For example, in the debate at Sparta, which is in your assignment. It's a particular part of the text, which is a series of speeches given at the outset of the war. In these speeches, you, as the reader, can examine directly the conflicting arguments and points of view. So, Thucydides, perhaps, is telling us that this is how we should try to understand the world from different points of view. Something to think about. Thucydides used this technique in his narrative style also. Take Pericles' funeral oration. This is another important section in your reading assignment. Pericles was a great Athenian statesman and an advocate of democracy, who in the text gives a very, very eloquent speech on the virtues of Athens. The speech is full of noble ideals, it stands in stark contrast to the absence of ideals in the reality of the plague epidemic that later ravaged the city. In the funeral oration, Pericles declaims to the Athenians, "What I would prefer is that you should fix your eyes every day on the greatness of Athens as she really is, and should fall in love with her. When you realize her greatness, then reflect that what made her great was men who were ashamed to fall below a certain standard." The standard of Athens is based on the lawfulness of Athens, we understand from the text. Pericles continues, "We are free and tolerant in our private lives, but in public affairs, we keep to the law. This is because it commands our deep respect. We give our obedience to those whom we put in positions of authority, and we obey the laws themselves, especially those which are the protection of the oppressed." And then there's a final clause, which is important. "And those unwritten laws, which it is an acknowledged shame to break." Unwritten laws. What's he talking about here? What could be an unwritten law? Perhaps he's telling us here that our behavior in society should be guided by laws. That's pretty apparent. But written laws aren't enough. Unwritten laws are required, maybe. Maybe the standards of personal virtue, the standards of moral behavior that we need to follow also. You can't write down all the rules, okay? Some of them simply have to be acknowledged, but clearly understood. Then Thucydides moves on to talking about the plague epidemic. So first we have the Pericles funeral oration, and then he situates the plague epidemic right after it. Again, the oppositions, right? Those unwritten laws in the course of his account of the plague appear to be little more than an illusion. In Thucydides' eyewitness account of the plague, he says, "In other respects also, Athens owed to the plague the beginnings of a state of unprecedented lawlessness. As for what is called honor, no one showed himself willing to abide by its laws, so doubtful was it whether we would survive to enjoy the name of it. It was generally agreed that what was both honorable and valuable was the pleasure of the moment and everything that might conceivably contribute to that pleasure. No fear of God or law of man had a restraining influence." Why does he contrast the greatness of Athenian law and virtue in the funeral oration and the appearance of lawlessness with the plague? Was he attacking Pericles and Athenian virtue? Was he simply being cynical, saying, all lies, a complete illusion? Think about this. Thucydides' understanding of both Pericles and the plague demonstrates his ability to see the deeper realities, okay? He's got different points of view there. For example, deeper realities like the tensions that underlie civic virtue and the fragility of the standards of human character. Whatever his background, Thucydides had a remarkable ability to observe the connections between the individual and the world the Greeks lived in. The author of the history of the Peloponnesian War was an Athenian. Let's kind of sum up here. He was an Athenian who served as a general in the Athenian army, who was removed from command for failure in that war, and he was punished, who wrote a history of that war he fought in. In other words, you might expect him to write a grossly biased history. And this is something you can discuss in class or think about. Think about his own point of view. Does he have a bias? All right? Is it detectable from the text? Moreover, he claims that his history will be of relevance for all time. So if his method of history might be matched, his confidence would certainly be hard to beat. Now, I think you may have heard the word hubris before. Is Thucydides' confidence an act born of hubris? For Thucydides, history meant a systematic inquiry into contemporary events. So you can think of the title of the book as Inquiry into the Peloponnesian War. He had little patience for the interest his predecessors, people like Herodotus, showed in the romantic element of the stories they recorded. His criticism of Herodotus and others is indirect, but it is certainly clear that he considered the historical method used by them to be entirely inadequate. He quietly remarks, "The rest of the Hellenes, too, make many incorrect assumptions, not only about the dimly remembered past, but also about contemporary history. Most people, in fact, will not take trouble in finding out the truth, but are much more inclined to accept the first story they hear." This, I think, is something we can apply to our own lives. Think about the things we hear, the things we hear and accept as truth, oftentimes based on familiarity, friendship, so on and so forth. What do those things possibly have to do with accuracy? Thucydides concerned himself only with contemporary events, and his approach to doing history rested on the conviction that little can be known of the distant past. I would argue that his historical method, his principles, his ability to distinguish what's significant, indeed proves for us today that much can be learned from any past, no matter how distant. So, what was his historical method? First of all, and here you'll start to see some differences, perhaps, with the readings you've had prior to this time. First of all, he avoided discussion of myths and gods. The supernatural in any form had no place in his analysis of human affairs. Politics and society were subjects to be examined with skepticism. He states that all evidence should be tested for accuracy. He says, and this is on the fly sheet, and with regard to my factual reporting of the events of the war, I have made it a principle not to write down the first story that came my way, and not even to be guided by my own general impressions. Either I was present myself at the events which I've described, or else I heard of them from eyewitnesses, whose reports I've checked with as much thoroughness as possible. He says that the accuracy of his evidence was further enhanced by his development of a chronological scheme in which to incorporate all his information, all his data. The lack of a standard calendar in ancient Greece compelled Thucydides to devise a system in which he measured time from the first year of the war, each year divided by summer and winter seasons. Thus, his array of verified information, placed within a proper context, allowed for the effective interpretation of the historical evidence. So, with that careful approach, you can start to maybe discriminate primary causes from secondary causes. Political and military events take on a superficial quality sometimes because there are deeper forces that affect them. As if they're symptoms, you're looking at this, looking not simply at the symptoms of a disease, but the causes of it. Much is made of Thucydides' method, but remember that his method was also tempered by his particular view. He talks about reasonable accuracy. He talks about truest causes. And so we're reminded that we're reading his interpretation of the war, just as we read his interpretation of the speeches that he reports to us in such detail. And of these speeches, he candidly states, I mean, how could he possibly have written them down? So when people are giving speeches, it's very hard to keep up with them, yeah? I found it difficult to remember the precise words used in the speeches which I listened to myself, and my various informants have experienced the same difficulty. So my method has been, while keeping as closely as possible to the general sense of the words that were actually used, to make the speeches say in what my opinion was called for by each situation. The historian Herodotus, whose picture I showed earlier, recreated the atmosphere of the past. Herodotus is the historian that Thucydides criticized. For Thucydides, recreating the past, though, was not enough. His historical method forms a narrative that contains arguments and interpretations, founded on the belief that our knowledge of the past is useful because we can understand it from all sides, and we can see the difference between the profound and the superficial. So his intellectual acuity may have been sharpened by his sophistic training, but by our reading between the lines, that's something we have to do as readers, we get the sense that the historical method was guided by moral convictions that ran as deep as those realities he was trying to bring to the surface. By means of understanding history, Thucydides, I think, believed we could make better political judgments. And political judgments are really moral judgments, aren't they? And at least understand, if not entirely avoid, such tragedies as the war between Athens and Sparta. So this is a huge book you're reading, and you're simply reading selections from it. What does the book consist of? One thing you could say is it consists of a series of arguments. So this is a way to kind of get your head around it. When we see the inquiry into the Peloponnesian War as an account of the past that includes interpretations and convictions, it becomes clear that the book contains a number of arguments. One might consider it, for example, a treatise on historiography, the method of doing history. After all, he argues that his evidence is more reliable than he says that of the poets, like Homer, perhaps, who exaggerate the importance of the themes, or of the prose chroniclers, perhaps like Herodotus, who's, I think, not in your syllabus, who are less interested in telling the truth than in catching the attention of their public, whose authorities cannot be checked, according to Thucydides. This method formed the foundation for additional arguments, like a historical argument, In the past, the Persian War, that is the war the Greeks had fought with Persia, had been considered the greatest war, and Herodotus made that claim. But Thucydides argued that the war between Athens and Sparta was the greatest war of all time. As he expresses it, more worth writing about than any of those which had taken place in the past. His reasons for this claim: it lasted such a long time, 27 years. He says, never before had so many cities been captured and then devastated, whether by foreign armies or by the Hellenic powers themselves. Never had there been so many exiles. Never had such loss of life, both in the actual warfare and in internal revolutions. And then the destruction wrought by humanity was followed by upheaval in the natural world. So earthquakes, eclipses, drought, famine, plague, all these calamities fell together upon the Hellenes after the outbreak of the Great War. So we have historiographical, we have historical, and then perhaps political. At another level, he argues that the power and greatness of Athens was a result of its development of navigation and commerce. The Athenian navy enabled the city to accumulate wealth, and this was the foundation of its empire. On the more immediate causes of the war, Thucydides reported the complaints of the two sides against each other and the clash of their respective interests. But those superficial causes obscured the real reason for the war, what he's kind of eventually getting to: imperial ambition. Thucydides argues that what made war inevitable was the growth of Athenian power and the fear which this caused in Sparta. His historical argument has even a wider reach, I think, in part because his method, which I've already mentioned, but also, more significantly, as with many thinkers of his era, the broad scope of his vision rested on the conviction that moral issues and conflicts were an integral element in politics. You can't distinguish the two. Thus, the history of the Peloponnesian War is not strictly a story of the conflict of Athens and Sparta. The story runs deeper. It's the story of moral conflict experienced by human character, or the story of the strengths and weaknesses of individuals and societies to understand forces that are sometimes very difficult to see. Okay? Just as Athenian democracy failed to comprehend the implications of imperial ambition. That's basically the end of the story. This wider understanding underlies his entire effort. He says, "It will be enough for me if these words of mine are judged useful by those who want to understand clearly the events which happened in the past and which, human nature being what it is, will at some time or other, and in much the same ways, be repeated in the future." The principles of his method and his vision of Hellenic history enable a deeper understanding of human affairs. And according to Thucydides, human nature, being what it is, this is an expression that he uses a couple times, makes such an understanding, I think, absolutely imperative. And implicitly, human nature also makes understanding possible. So, if his main thesis deals with the history of imperial ambition, and his approach to history is founded on moral convictions, how do these elements relate to each other? One way to answer this question is to start by untangling the various strands of the conflict. Okay, and this is where the text gets pretty heavy. At the time of the Peloponnesian War, Greece was not unified. It consisted of city-states and villages, their inhabitants speaking dialects of Greek. So here's a map of the Hellenic Peninsula and the islands. It consisted of city-states and villages. They all spoke dialects of Greek, all shared a common heritage and religion and poetry. These various small states shared a distinct sense that they were Greek and different from everyone else, whose essential characteristic was, at least from the Greek point of view, that they were foreigners. So they're barbarians, and that's where what the word comes from. They babble, okay? They don't speak Greek. In spite of this common identity, however, Thucydides informs us that there existed a variety of differences between the Greek city-states. In particular, there were fundamental differences in culture, economics, politics that separated these two cities, Athens and Sparta. The inhabitants of Athens and Sparta spoke two different dialects. The Athenians were Ionian, okay? The Spartans were Dorian. They had different customs. Although such differences are often superficial, the cultural divide between the Spartans and the Athenians ran even deeper. Just as Sparta was landlocked in the middle of the Peloponnesus, the peninsula at the very bottom, it also isolated itself from cultural change. The Spartan educational system helped them field the most disciplined and effective army in the Hellenic world. And it also helped them resist the new intellectual attitudes, like those of the sophists and the approaches of people like Plato, who you'll read in the future, sweeping over 5th century Greece. Athens, on the other hand, was receptive to all sorts of innovation and was open to Greece's intellectual and artistic revolution. The speeches of the debate at Sparta suggest to us that the gulf was so deep between them that conflict was practically inevitable. And the speech of the Corinthians expands on these differences. So the Corinthians are seeing both these groups of people and seeing them as very different. An Athenian, the Corinthian says, is always an innovator, quick to form a resolution and quick at carrying it out. You Spartans, on the other hand, are good at keeping things as they are. You never originate an idea. Your action tends to stop short of its aim. So on the one hand, you have people who are kind of moving, okay. The other hand, you have people who are more conservative and more kind of entrenched, at least from that point of view. The war between Athens and Sparta was as much a conflict of cultures as it was a war of politics. So you can compare the maps, and you can see how the culture and politics kind of overlap with each other. Another major difference between Athens and Sparta concerned their economic circumstances. Now, in the fly sheet, I've tried to kind of create a table that shows these various differences to kind of make it a little bit more clear. The Spartans, in the middle of the Peloponnesian Peninsula, were self-sufficient in food. So we see even these differences in terms of their economies. Consequently, the city was rich in natural resources, but poor in money. Athens, in contrast, had too little farmland to support its population, and it relied extensively on seaborne commerce to supply its needs in food and timber. Timber for ships, food for the population. Aside from its mineral wealth, remember the gold mines in northern Greece, Athens was a thriving commercial center, so it had access to a steady income, and it was further enriched by money collected from the members of the alliance it held. Of the alliance it led. And it was this wealth that enabled Athens to build the Parthenon and other monumental buildings that the city is so well known for. So we often, of course, take these buildings to represent Athenian democracy. Perhaps we should also think about them as representing Athenian empire. The political constitutions of these states were radically different as well. Sparta possessed a form of government, very stable. After all, it's kind of entrenched and conservative. That combined elements of monarchy and aristocracy. Sparta's agricultural domain was worked by a conquered people called the Helots, who outnumbered the Spartans and who were liable to rebel if Sparta showed any signs of weakness. And so to prevent this from happening, the Spartans relied on their stable government, their rigid educational system, to build a powerful land-based military. And in contrast to Sparta, Athens, the Athenians had established a democracy, at least after a certain period of upheaval. The citizens of Athens, a category, of course, that did not include women and slaves. So even though it's a democracy, there is the institution of slavery, okay, and women don't have any political rights. Nevertheless, those individuals who were citizens could participate fully in the public affairs of Athens. In the view of Thucydides, who was not a proponent of radical democracy, it might be said, the proper functioning of Athenian democracy depended on the quality of its leading citizens. This is where virtue and character come into the picture. Virtue and character, which I mentioned earlier. For example, he says of Pericles, because of his position, intelligence, and his known integrity, Pericles could respect the liberty of the people and at the same time hold them in check. So in what was nominally a democracy, power was really in the hands of the first citizen. But the collective citizenry could vote, and thus the city's policy could change quickly to suit their wishes. Because an effective speaker could easily sway the assembly, for some reason Donald Trump kind of comes to mind, okay? Men who lacked virtue, okay, hope he doesn't sue me, used their influence to manipulate the citizens of Athens. For Thucydides, Cleon was perhaps the most notorious of these demagogues. A demagogue is one who would exploit popular prejudices or passions for his own political gain, for the violence of his character. That expression from Thucydides kind of captures some of these politicians that we have to deal with these days, okay, and their influence over the citizenry. And I haven't, maybe there is a statue of Cleon somewhere. If you find one, let me know. But it seems to me that no one made one of him for obvious reasons. It was the powerful influence of demagogues like Cleon that made the political life of a democracy like Athens so precarious. Thucydides' opposition, let's go back to the oppositions. His opposition of men like Pericles and Cleon, men of virtuous character, opposed to those without virtue, give us a hint that he was arguing that goodness or virtue may have been one of the victims of the war. So the various cultural, economic, and political features of these two city shaped their respective imperial policies. While Sparta oppressed a subject population at home, the various states within its Peloponnesian League acted with considerable independence. In other words, foreign policy doesn't necessarily reflect domestic policy. The League's political and military decisions tended to be slow, expressed in the opinion of the Corinthians, again at the debate of Sparta, since the member states of the League required time to consult. Athens, in contrast, was ruthless and characteristically quick to lord it over its so-called allies, to the extent that Athenian democracy counted for nothing beyond its walls. So think now about kind of democratic states which establish empires and the extent to which their imperial stretch is a reflection of domestic policy. Athenian imperial ambition grew out of its powerful political position at the end of the preceding war with Persia, what Herodotus, again, had called the greatest war. The growth of Athenian power, Thucydides argued, endangered Sparta's political security. The gradual realization of Athenian imperial ambitions upset the balance of power between Athens and Sparta. The pressures built up to such a degree that diplomatic maneuvering against weaker neutral states triggered the armed conflict between the two powers. Thucydides showed that in an imperial world, the political neutrality of cities such as Melos, which you can visit, described in the Melian dialogue, another part of your assignment, could be as flimsy as Athenian democracy and was simply a prelude to their destruction. If you're not with us, you're against us. It's that type of attitude in this kind of world, this kind of imperial world. In this respect, Thucydides was realistic in his depiction, but I think that realism should not obscure his idealism as well. So how can we penetrate this mass of arguments and historical data? I've noted on the fly sheet the three phases of the war. I'm not going to go through, the chronology of it. It's a complex book, and when you read it, I think you have to kind of look for the themes. Don't get bogged down in the details. So the themes are really things to emphasize. Empire and ambition, justice, noble purpose, virtue, human character, understanding, that is, how can we understand the world? We know that this is the story of a war between Athens and Sparta, but what was at the center of the conflict? What was lost or gained in the conflict? And I kind of alluded to some of these things that were lost already. Thucydides mourns the general deterioration of character throughout the Greek world, what he calls the simple way of looking at things. Think about that. It's a very interesting way to expression, the simple way of looking at things. What does he mean by that? Perhaps that political ambition can distort the way we see things, lead to moral collapse. Within 3 years of the start of the conflict, Athens' allies rebelled, as Mytilene did, another place you can visit. Okay? This was a matter of grave concern to the Athenians, since the Mytileneans had a large fleet, and it was very valuable. It was a very valuable ally to the Athenians. The issue of how to resolve the Mytilenean problem was debated by the Athenians. And this is in the Mytilenean debate, another component of your assignment. Some Athenians, led by Cleon, felt compelled to make an example of Mytilene by killing all of its male citizens and enslaving its women and children. This was actually a fairly common practice in Greek warfare. Cleon argued, punish them as they deserve and make an example of them to your other allies, plainly showing that revolt will be punished by death. The central issue of the debate, however, is not whether to spare the Mytileneans, but what is best for Athens. Pericles had foreshadowed the moral blindness that would afflict Athens when he said, "Your Athenian empire is like a tyranny. It may have been wrong to take it. It is certainly dangerous to let it go." In the debate, Cleon the demagogue echoed him. Okay, he echoes him. "If the Mytileneans were justified in revolting, then you Athenians must be wrong in holding power." So, what's the point here? The virtuous ruler and the demagogue start to sound frightfully similar, okay, in this imperial context. The moral foundation of noble character is destroyed by the demands of empire. The moral collapse of Athenian politics foreshadowed the moral collapse of Greek society, first observed in the civil war in Corcyra, another holiday destination, okay, where you can read this incredible passage from Thucydides. Fathers killed their sons. Men were dragged from the temples or butchered on the very altars. Some were actually walled up in the temple of Dionysus and died there. The bonds of family were desecrated, as all the other elements of social life, even language, that thing that binds us together in a common community. To fit in with the change of events, words too had to change their usual meanings. What used to be described as a thoughtless act of aggression was now regarded as the courage one would expect to find in a party member. Okay? And he goes on. Any idea of moderation, down at the bottom, was just an attempt to disguise one's unmanly character. The ability to understand a question from all sides meant that one was totally unfitted for action. This may have been Thucydides' problem, actually. Okay? He was dismissed from command. It could well be that he didn't see things in kind of a black and white way that you might have to in the context of a conflict. After the death of Pericles, 2.5 years after the start of the war, the state of Athens deteriorated even more. Thucydides relates that Pericles' successors lacked his foresight and character, adopting methods of demagogy, which resulted in their losing control over the actual conduct of affairs. Not only did they lose control over political affairs, but they ultimately lost the basis of their empire. Private ambition and private profit led to policies which were bad both for the Athenians themselves and for their allies. With the loss of character, it's too easy to adopt the principle that might makes right, as at Melos and at Syracuse, as you can see from quotes on the fly sheet. Okay, at the end of the war, when the tables were turned, the Athenians were on the verge of being enslaved themselves. Okay, and that takes us to the island of Sicily. Athens failed to understand the situation from all sides. So, just to sum up, what are we to learn from Thucydides' history? What lessons might it teach us so that, in his words, his work would last forever? The history of the Peloponnesian War has as many lessons as it has arguments, I think. Clearly, the history was built on the solid foundation of his convincing method, his convictions about character, shaped by his vision of history, and it has more to teach us than the story of the dissolution of an empire, or simply Athens' defeat. Thucydides speaks of standards of character. And so while Athens and Sparta were the chief opponents in the Peloponnesian War, in many respects, the protagonists of this history are Athens, I would say, and Thucydides perhaps himself. Pericles' funeral oration, which I mentioned earlier, praised Athens as a lesson for Greece. Remember that rousing speech? The irony of this praise in the larger context of Thucydides' story is revealing. Athens was a lesson for us, but not only in an admirable way. Consider what lesson Athens almost taught at Mytilene and did teach at Melos, or what her army demonstrated outside Syracuse. Don't follow the example of Athens. Human nature being what it is, the fragile role of the noble character in human affairs makes the lesson of political ambition one that will be relevant forever. As for Thucydides, with his ability to understand a question from all sides, and the man had a very sharp eye, I think, for pretense. He could distinguish the profound from the shallow. He penetrated the surface of his era's moral system, exposing the fragility of human goodness. Athens lost the war, and political ambition claimed a lot of victims. But perhaps the real victim was noble character, the simple way of looking at things. Time and again in the history, he shows us that justice is honored more in speech than in action, more by the weak than by the powerful. But that doesn't make it right. By following his standards of thoughtful judgment and character, perhaps we too can sharpen our vision of humanity and achieve something in the study and practice of virtue. So good luck to you in your study and practice of virtue. And have a good day.